Gary Giddins, writer, critic. Well, I think all of us begin as writers. I wanted to be a writer from the time I was 8, long before I ever heard of jazz. The question is, once you have that obsession, what is your subject going to be? And you often don't know for some time. It might become fiction, it might be nonfiction, and if it's nonfiction, it could go in any number of directions. I didn't realize what my subject was for quite some time. I knew I wanted to write criticism because I loved reading criticism, and I just had a response to that and knew I had an ability for it. But I studied English literature and expected to be a literary critic. Jazz was something that I loved. It was an obsession of mine, but I wasn't a musician or a musicologist. I didn't think I really had the right to write about jazz. But then after I got out of school, my first job actually was as a film critic for The Hollywood Reporter, and I felt that jazz criticism was terribly lacking. A lot of the things I wanted to say and the musicians I admired weren't being written about, or I felt I had something to say that nobody else was saying. And people would say to me, editors, you know a lot about jazz, would you do a jazz piece for me? And finally I just bit the bullet and left off film writing for, gosh, about more than 15 years, and then really committed myself entirely to jazz crit. Well, the first critic who sort of made the veil drop from my eyes was Dwight MacDonald. MacDonald was a film critic for Esquire in the early 60s, and he was very funny and polished, and I really liked his voice. And then shortly after that, I discovered Edmund Wilson, particularly the two. I remember buying Axel's Castle and having a hard time with it because I hadn't read most of the writers in it. But then I got The Shores of Light, which is his collection of essays from the 20s, and Classics and Commercials. And Wilson really sort of set me on my path. There were a number of other critics at the same time that I was reading. James Agee's film reviews. In jazz, the two critics I loved the most were Martin Williams and Dan Morgenstern. I became completely obsessed with a turn-of-the-century critic who isn't read anymore, I don't know why, named James Gibbon Honecker, who published some 24 volumes in a notorious novel about an orgy at the opera called Painted Veils, which was once a bestseller, but I don't even think that's in print anymore. Max Beerbohm's theater criticism I love, Shaw's music criticism. Well, I became completely obsessed with reading criticism. Well, Johnson was a big thing in my life when I first started to read Lives of the Poets, and Matthew Arnold, Eliot's criticism. I ended up doing my senior thesis on Edmund Wilson, T.S. Eliot, and Hemingway as critics. So I think that path was pretty much clear for me at that point. That's an interesting question. I think I should begin by just briefly exploring the issue of who one writes for. And I've always thought, for me, there's no question about it, that you're writing for some version of yourself. You're writing the kinds of things that you like to read or wanted to read at a certain point. So primarily, for most of my career, I've written the kind of criticism that fascinates me, the things I discover, the things that get me going, that I'm excited about. At the same time, you want to share that enthusiasm. But this new book, Jazz, was a very deliberate attempt to put the literary issues aside and even some of the more constant enthusiasms and really try to share what I've learned in 45 years about the way jazz works, how to listen to it. It's always sort of bugged me that people are intimidated by it. They're intimidated by improvisation. They say, I like it, but I don't really understand it, as though there was something mystical and complicated. And I found from teaching years ago, and Scott DeVoe, my co-author on this book, who is a dedicated professor at the University of Virginia for a quarter of a century, you find out that, well, at least I found out that when I explained what a blues form is, 12-bar blues or 32-bar pop song, it just clicks in people's heads, and suddenly they begin to hear popular music in a whole different way. There's a wonderful story that Martin Williams used to tell. He was lecturing at, I think he was lecturing at NYU as a guest lecturer, and he started explaining the 12-bar blues and the 32-bar pop song, and the fact that 90% of all the pop songs ever written in America, 32 bar is AABA. And there was a guy in the audience who was basically a cocktail pianist. He earned his living playing at Holiday Inns, and he knew thousands of songs. And as Martin is talking about the AABA form, he suddenly slaps his forehead and says, "That's right!" So, I mean, even this guy who knows them all hadn't really thought of it that way. But when you hear it, when you understand the way chords work and the way harmonies build and then resolve in 8-bar increments or 12 bars, suddenly improvisation doesn't seem so complicated anymore. And for me, the trick is to learn how to listen the way the musicians are listening, which is not that difficult. I'm not a musicologist. So this book was really written for people who have no more musicological ability than I do. The challenge in analyzing the 78 tracks that we chose was in doing it in a language that was non-musicological. No. Writing style is something that is a consequence of who you are. I think that I had a certain ability, a certain propensity for a style that I recognize in my early work, but that doesn't mean I didn't have to learn certain basics. And the longer you write, the better you get. You know, the rhythms come from you. If the rhythms seem to echo the music, then that's delightful if people see that, but it's certainly not something that's intentional on my part. I'm trying to be as clear and precise as I can be, and at the same time, I'm trying to be eloquent and witty and entertaining. I mean, writing should be a pleasure. One of the things I always underscore when I teach criticism is that young critics or would-be critics frequently have this illusion that if they write about music, they're somehow part of music, or if they write about movies, they're part of movies, or if they write about theater, they're part of theater, or write about literature. That writing is a part of literature. I mean, we belong to the species of literature. If you add all the music reviews together that have ever been written, they don't create 2 notes of music. So the question of jazz or film or whatever the subject is, it's just a matter of finding the subject that allows you to express yourself as a writer. I mean, critics, just as novelists write about the world through the fabrications of fictional imagination, we write about the world as we experience it through the arts. And for me, jazz is a way to deal with, you know, the development of the 20th century on so many different levels, especially race, the high art versus low art controversy that never ends, and then the whole way an art that's fairly recent develops, how it starts in a community as a kind of folk music, just functionally supporting the dance traditions of one little place, and then it spreads, and every place it spreads, it's changed by whatever community it enters. When it goes to New York, it's completely changed. When it goes to Chicago, it's completely changed. And then at some point it becomes worldwide and even popular music, and then suddenly it becomes more self-conscious about itself as an art and leaves the popular stage, and then it becomes a thing that academics study. So this whole thing, you know, you can write about it in terms of the stage or literature, but then you're writing really about something that happened long before you were born. But with jazz or cinema, it's really, these are arts that are about 100 years old, so we're writing about something pretty much as it's happening, and that's very exciting. Well, everything that's of any value merits academic study, and I suppose even some things that aren't of any value. I mean, there's all kinds of popular culture courses that go into areas that I don't really see the point of. But the sad truth is that in the 1930s or 1940s, people, me, when I was growing up in the 60s, I listened to jazz because I loved it. I didn't need anybody. I could teach myself about it by, reading books and reviews, but mostly through listening. I hate the idea of turning of jazz into a homework assignments. I mean, I would never have a quiz saying who's the clarinetist on the Hot Five. I don't care. If you like the clarinetist, you'll know who it is. I don't, that. But appreciation is another thing. Music appreciation, a way how to enjoy it. I mean, I am astounded at my age with a 20-year-old daughter to discover that kids of her generation don't want to watch black and white movies. I understand that they gave up on silent films, but black and white. And so now movies have to be taught in academia because people don't know how to watch them. They don't know how to appreciate them. So it's inevitable that that's where it's going to happen. But if the class turns it into something dry and academic and a question of memorization, then I say the hell with it. If it doesn't give you pleasure, go someplace else. Jazz is for joy. It's for euphoria. It's for emotion and anguish and excitement and all of the joys that great art can produce. And if it loses that, then it's lost everything. Well, my answer to that hasn't changed in most of the years I've been doing this. I think, first of all, if you're a critic, I'm a critic. That means you're a writer. So yes, you have to make yourself an authority on whatever subject it's going to be, music, movies, literature, whatever it's going to be. But what you really want to do is learn your trade by reading other writers. I think you have to read voraciously, especially people who've done what you've done, to see how it's been done in the past, what works, what doesn't work. When I teach criticism, I'm not a great admirer of Pauline Kael. Forgive me, I know a lot of people are. But I used to use Pauline Kael as an example in my class of everything you ought not to do, from the imperial we to the arrogance to the predictability of liking anything by a certain artist or hating anything by another certain artist. But on the other hand, yes, you should read her for yourself, obviously. By reading different critics, you find out who speaks to you and what kind of voice you want to have. So I think that's the first thing. And then in terms of succeeding, because of who you are and what your voice is, and you have to have passion. If you don't have a passion for it, why would you bother? This is not a way to make a living in any conventional sense. So you really need to have the passion and the belief, arrogant though it may be, to believe that you're saying something that nobody else is saying. The early years of my work, I have to say I often felt guilty because I was having such a good time. I couldn't believe I was allowed to make a living, first of all, listening to this music that I loved and writing about it. And there is something bizarre about spending your days exploring the obsessions of your adolescence. But as you get older, you want to get different. You want to do different things. First, you're sort of delivering yourself of everything you know, and a part of your early writing, and I notice this in young critics all the time, and I was certainly guilty of this. There's a bit of showing off because you've just entered the stage and you want to prove that you have something. So you're sometimes making statements that are louder than they need to be. This is too many masterpieces, and this is beneath contempt, and you're not really dealing with art in the right proportion. For me, one way it changed was that I was primarily concerned with live performance for many years. I loved writing about recordings, but I was out there on average 4 nights a week for the first, I would say, 15 years I was at The Voice. And most of the pieces I did were about what I heard live. And I had invented this job for myself at The Voice. It didn't really exist in any other publication. I never wanted to be a daily critic who goes out every night and writes 300-word reviews. I wanted to write essays. And that gave me the luxury of being able to go out, and if it was lousy, I could just say, well, the hell with that, I'll go hear something else, or I'll go tomorrow night. I was writing for a weekly, and I only wanted to write about things that interested me as a writer as well as a listener. But then my daughter was born in the late 80s. And suddenly I started resenting being out. I wanted to be home. I wanted to be able to put her to sleep. You don't get those chances again. And so without even realizing at first, I started going out less, and I started doing more and more columns about recordings. And in the course of that, I began, my aesthetic changed a lot, I think, because first of all, I was exploring a lot of recordings that I thought I knew cold, but as you get older, they change as you change, and you begin to hear different things. And so that was one, and I still wrote live about important concerts and certainly festivals, but at the same time, something else changed with me, and that's this. The Village Voice, once I got my column after I'd been there for a year, I had a column for 30 years. I wrote it every other week, 1,800 words for the most part, occasionally down to 16, something like that. It was my page. Nobody ever told me how to fill it. After a while, you begin to realize that spending 1,800 words telling people not to buy a recording that they never heard of in the first place is stupid. It's a waste of your time. It doesn't tell the reader anything. So I became much more of an enthusiast. I became much more of a critic who wants to tell you, you got to hear this. That's what I kept looking for. Now, I listen to things blind. I have an assistant, and I have one of those CD players with you can put 5 discs in, and she puts the discs in and keeps the boxes in the other room, and I go through them, and, with the remote, if I see something I like, then I look. Usually I recognize it, but frequently I don't. And that way, frequently you're surprised. People that you think I don't want to bother with will sometimes grab you. And other times, it can go either way. I worry far more about negative reviews than positive ones. If I'm reviewing a record, man, I play that record to death, which is ironic in a way, because if I review a concert, I feel very confident of myself, certainly at this point, and have for most of my career. You're only hearing it once, and then you go to your typewriter and you write the review. But with a record, I never do that. I have to play the record over and over again, and if I don't like it, I have to really kind of come to grips with what is it that I don't like and articulate it. When I teach criticism, the first thing I say, and this sometimes pisses off students, is that opinions are the least part of criticism. We've all had the experience of going with a friend to a movie or a concert, and you leave the theater, and one of you loved it and one of you hated it. And that doesn't mean that one of you is an idiot. That's the way things work. Now, the question is not who's right, because there is no right. The question is how you articulate it. That's where criticism comes into play. There are reviews that are clearly wrong. Dr. Johnson's famous Life of Savage. He's clearly wrong about the value of Savage, but it's one of the great works in English literature. You can learn more about the artistic expression and what the poet does and how to write about art from that than any number of guys who are terrible writers, who have no original ideas, but who say, yes, Hamlet is a wonderful play. It's a meaningless statement. So it's all about first of all being candid and honest, letting nothing else interfere with your perception of the work, and then finding a means of articulation that somehow makes the work come alive, and if you dislike it, gives your argument some validity. I couldn't write that piece today. I actually have become much more fond of and really excited about Keith's playing over years, but that's why criticism ultimately, at some degree, is about the writer and not the subject. It's very easy if everybody else says he's a genius to echo that, but then you're not functioning as a critic or as a writer in any meaningful way. You've got to take the risk of being wrong. But my feeling, of course, is that if you're genuinely candid and expressive, then you're never wrong, even when you are wrong. The only sociological purpose I can remember that I had to deal with and sort of get past was race. I grew up with this idea that, it was a fact, it wasn't just an idea, that white musicians were given all kinds of help that were denied black musicians. This is an African American music. Most of the great figures have been black. And yet in the 30s, it was the white bands that got all the great hotel gigs and all the great radio hookups. It was frequently, even in the 50s and 60s, when I was coming up, the white bands frequently got the most attention. I remember everybody saying that Stan Getz was punished for years because of something that a critic wrote about him in Life magazine. Albert Goldman said that he was the greatest saxophone player in the world. This is at a time when Coleman Hawkins was alive and Sonny Rollins, and it was so offensive. Really would have been offensive to say that about anybody because it was ridiculous, but it seemed like it was always the white guy. And so a lot of people started to put down Stan Getz, and I remember having lunch one day. I was writing a liner note for a wonderful saxophone player, black musician, when we were having lunch, and he made some kind of disparaging remark about Stan Getz, and I had done this myself, and I said, but isn't Stan a great player? And he looked at me and he said, of course he's a great player. So, you have to sort of get by that. Getz is one of the supreme figures in my judgment. But there was so much of that, and I really had to deal with it. And in the 70s, I used to talk about this with other critics, white and black, that we'd say, like, if you're standing on 20th Street, and a new white band is coming to town on 15th, and a new black band is coming into town on 25th, it's 5 blocks that way or this way, we'd all go to see the black band. Just the assumption from history is that something more is going to be happening there. So I think at some point you just finally have to really try to become colorblind and say, this guy is saying something and this guy isn't, and it isn't a question of race, and it isn't a question of gender. That was a big issue that we started to deal with because while most of my favorite singers have always been women, there haven't been a lot of really notable women instrumentalists. There, Mary Lou Williams, the great genius, she's always the token female in every discussion of instrumentalists and orchestrators and composers. But there have been so many really gifted women players in the last several years. So that's been something that you have to deal with. But on the other hand, you don't want to say, well, she's really good just because she's a woman or because she's cute. There was a lot of that too. I remember there was a Notorious piece in an essay in which this guy was going on and on about this woman musician, and he just described her legs once too many times to make it a credible piece. Well, first of all, the work is never tied to the judgment. Moby Dick, widely criticized. If you go back and read the reviews that Melville got in the early 1850s, these are not stupid people for the most part. They are actually put off by what they consider to be this young man's pretentiousness in daring to write a Shakespearean novel. We don't have that same problem. But it did take, 70 years for Moby Dick to find there was a professor at Columbia named Raymond Weaver who started writing about it in the early 20s, right around the time they discovered the manuscript of Billy Budd. It's only since then that Moby Dick has become this, mammoth work in our literature. And everybody knows that Vincent van Gogh couldn't sell a painting, and that Thelonious Monk for many years was considered a charlatan, and Cecil Taylor was considered a charlatan, and all of that kind of nonsense. Very little criticism has proven to be enduring, so it has to really be essential. I mean, Aristotle, yes, some of his criticism is enduring. Johnson is read by English majors like me. I mean, try to find an inexpensive copy of Lives of the Poets. It's not easy. It's not, for a long time you couldn't find a decent edition of Boswell's Life of Johnson. Matthew Arnold's criticism isn't read anymore. Eliot's is not widely read anymore. There are very few, Wilson, I think because so many of us grew up with him and find him to be an extremely important American writer. But look how many years it took for the Library of America to put out 2 volumes of Edmund Wilson, who founded the Library of America. It was his idea. And this was a great source of embarrassment to the editors at the Library of America, but, criticism didn't sell. They put out 2 volumes of Henry James' criticism. Brilliant stuff. They put out Edgar Allan Poe's criticism. Criticism is a hard sale. Most people aren't interested in reading it. So I think it's mostly critics that read classic criticism. But to my sorrow, and I've had this conversation a zillion times, most even of my colleagues don't read classic criticism. And my feeling is that if you don't do that, then you're not really practicing your craft. That's how you learn how to do it. You don't learn how to write about jazz just from listening to jazz. You learn how to write by reading the great writers and how they worked, the great music critics. Now, one of the essential books that I always recommend to anybody who wants to write about or even think about music is Slanimsky's, what is it called, The Dictionary of Musical Invective. And it's a collection of quotes by critics over the last 250 years that are just so totally off base that they're hilarious. You know, no one will ever listen to Beethoven's Third Symphony because it's 40 minutes long, and who will ever listen to a 40-minute symphony? And Beethoven's response was to write a 90-minute symphony. But when you read those reviews in the context of their period, these are not stupid people. They're simply reflecting the tastes and the limitations of that period. But Slanimsky's is a book you should have on your bookshelf just to keep you humble. Humility is a very important trait in a critic. Oh, God, I wish I had $1 for every time someone has asked me that question. And I never have an answer. I mean, I would say that Louis Armstrong is the be-all and the end-all. And you should certainly listen to something by Armstrong, the 1928 recordings, or one of the great recordings from the 1950s. Of modern jazz, Ellington, certainly there should be an album by Ellington, probably a collection from the early 40s, or maybe a late work like, it's funny, the other night I was listening, just by coincidence, I was listening to Stravinsky's Petrushka, and it reminded me of a piece, The Bird of Delhi, from one movement of it, from Ellington's Far East Suite. And I played Ellington's Far East Suite, a piece I've always loved. And it's greater than and I always thought it was great, but it's greater. It's even greater than I thought. I really feel like now I want to write about it in a completely different way. So if you start there, you'll know who Ellington is. It doesn't have to be with Mood Indigo or some, agreed upon, received wisdom masterpiece. Everybody loves Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. So be different. Choose something else like Milestones or My Funny Valentine or, Porgy and Bess. I mean, these are all such magnificent recordings. Monk, I think Solo Monk, nobody can resist Solo Monk. When I was in school, and the one thing that my rock and roll friends who really didn't have any interest in jazz, they all ended up buying Monk. You just can't resist Solo Monk. Nobody can. It's just too happy and swinging and surprising and whimsical and witty and brilliant, and it just makes you think about everything in a different way. That's more than 5 already, I suppose. But one of the things we say in this book is, my job is to be a jazz historian and critic, so I got to listen to everything, but you don't. You may love the swing era. You may get really turned on by Ellington and Basie and Jimmy Lunsford and Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw and Andy Kirk and all these fantastic swing bands. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to love the avant-garde. I think one of the great periods is 1945 to 1949, when bebop was really pure. I'm not aware of a bad record that was made in those 4 years by anybody. But, you may get completely obsessed with that and may find, traditional jazz or swing dull. And then at some point in your life, you may go back to it and say, hey, now I get that. The point is to go with what really turns you on. People should not feel intimidated by received wisdom. You have to discover it yourself. If I tell you that Armstrong is great, it's meaningless. You have to hear it. Every once in a while, I meet somebody who's just had the Armstrong experience, and it's always the same, and I love it, because at one point you think, well, he's entertaining or he's this or that, but then suddenly they get it the way they get Bach's B minor Mass, which for me was a benchmark as a kid, and suddenly they know that this guy really was God. That there's nothing. Bing Crosby said that Armstrong is the beginning and the end of music in America, and he wasn't far wrong. Ken Burns, when he was making his jazz documentary, I was very cynical about it. He was going around saying he didn't know anything about jazz, but that in a few years he would, and all of this. And I'm thinking it's not that easy. And then I was talking to him, and he had just been converted by Armstrong, and you can't disguise that. He had a glow on about it, and the words he was using. And I thought, brother, he's in the tent, fine. Well, nobody knows where jazz is going because nobody has ever known where jazz is going. I mean, you couldn't possibly predict the swing era from the 20s or bebop from the swing era or avant-garde from bebop or fusion and on and on and on. So we don't really know where it's going. But I would say this. I don't think we're going to be seeing those kinds of distinct and discrete movements like swing, bop, and fusion. I think now it's a question of individuals. Now, one thing is important to remember is that in the early years of jazz, a lot of major musicians like Fletcher Henderson and Don Redman had, college educations and degrees and all of that. But a lot of the great figures like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker did not. I mean, Armstrong didn't even go through high school. Hundreds, if not thousands, of major figures learned on the bandstand. That was their apprenticeship. Today, the apprenticeship of musicians is in the college orchestra. I mean, you're just not going to meet a musician who hasn't, got at least a BA and probably an MA and hasn't been to a music school and hasn't had giant steps as a homework assignment. So it's very different. So because they have this historical perspective, they aren't necessarily just coming out of whatever their generation is into. And also because they're growing up and they don't have the same prejudices against pop music that certain generations had, they can use that. So, today's musicians who maybe grew up with hip hop may use hip hop beats in a way that if you're not looking for them, you won't even hear it. But it's there. It's informing the way they think of rhythm. And they may use things that they picked up from Ellington or Dizzy Gillespie that isn't particularly obvious. It's not a homage. It's not a matter of playing Con Alma or Sophisticated Lady. It's just voicings or some idea that they picked up. So all of this becomes part of the brew. And what we're really looking for in the future of jazz is the individual who is saying something that expresses him or herself. That's what I look for. I look for some spark of originality or of individuality that sets this musician apart from the pack. The general level of musicianship in jazz is probably higher now than it's ever been. I can't get very excited about a musician who can do Art Tatum because I've got the Art Tatum records. I want to hear him take that and do something that hasn't been done. And there's enough of that going around that keeps the music very exciting. There's so many great young players coming out. I think we're in some kind of renaissance, especially in the rhythm section. I mean, where the musicians on drums and bass and guitar are really trying to figure out different ways to bring a rhythm section together. So, the crossover is a constant thing. One of the things we do in the book, which I think is fairly novel, I don't think anyone's done it before, but we have 2 chapters on fusion instead of 1. Everybody, when they talk about fusion, they usually are talking about the jazz rock thing that happened in the late 60s and 70s when Miles Davis recorded Bitches Brew and, Chick Corea and John McLaughlin, all these guys came along and had fusion bands using elements of rock. But we make an argument that fusion has always been part of jazz and that you can actually create a sort of fusion history of jazz. If you go back even into the 30s, where did Louis Jordan, the father of rhythm and blues, come out of? The Chick Webb Orchestra. Where did the salsa movement come out of? Machito and Mario Bava, who played with, and Dizzy Gillespie, who played with all the big bands. There's always been, Jelly Roll Morton said you can't make jazz without using certain elements of Latin music. So there's always been this let me say it this way. I'll quote Dexter Gordon's famous line. He said, "Jazz is an octopus. It will take whatever it can use, and it will work with it." So I think the distinctions aren't as clear as we like to think. Jason Moran, who is the subject of the last chapter in our book, because we decided to use, instead of trying to cover the whole scene, we decided to use a representative jazz musician, at the age of 30, which he was at the time we were writing. And the two tracks we analyzed by him, one is his version of a 1930 James P. Johnson stride piece called "You've Got to Be Modernistic," which he takes completely into the realm of thoroughly modern, semi-avant-garde jazz. And the other is Afrika Bambaata's "Planet Rock," which he does the same. Now, anybody who knows the James P. number will recognize it. Anybody who knows the Bambaataa number will recognize it, but they will also see that he's done something completely different. And it's not a question of doing something clever or cute. This is what he grew up with. It's his right to use it. We're going to see a lot more of that.